The US-Cuba relationship has a complicated history. After the failed US attempt to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, tensions quickly escalated between the two neighbours. In 1962, the Soviet Union reached an agreement to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The now famous images of several missile sites began the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
The Cuban Missile Crisis quickly became one of the tensest periods of the Cold War.
But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Reports of an increased presence from China and Cuba are a stark reminder of the tense relationship the two countries have.
In many respects, it's less the intelligence than the symbology. If we remember back to the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Russians came into Cuba and they gradually built up to the point where they put missiles that could hit the United States there. And so what the Chinese are doing is taking steps in to see whether they can be tolerated there. In many ways, right, trying to get a foothold in the door, and then, right, it's the training base is next. And once you have a training base, right, well, are they bringing weapons? What are they bringing in? And now all of a sudden, it's not that you have intelligence, 90 miles from Florida. It's that you have Chinese weapons and systems, Chinese aircraft, perhaps Chinese aircraft carriers now transiting between the United States and Cuba. So that's what they're trying to do. But it's a very dangerous game for both the Cubans and the Chinese, right? The United States, right, the Kennedy administration did not, take warmly to when the Russians did that, and they responded, fairly aggressively once it became public. So now that this is public and we know that there's going to be training there, what happens when missiles and aircraft and ships start showing up? The Chinese have started doing that in Djibouti, right, in Africa, and they're putting ships, and so they're slowly testing the water to see what they can get away with without ratcheting things up. And we're allowing them to, in many ways, we're like the frog in the proverbial, boiling pot of water where the heat's being turned up slowly. We don't notice it.
The U.S. starting, or at least within recent years, starting under the Trump administration and continued partly under the Biden administration, has, that relationship's been rockier than, say, it was under the Obama administration. And although the Biden people have attempted to kind of reach out in some ways on some issues to do with immigration, communications, travel, tourism, I think there's an opening for China with Cuba because of the state of play right now. Somebody else was positing that Cuba is also looking at the U.S. response to a lot of other things around the world and recognizing that maybe they have an opening. But I would say generally that Cuba has an opening to work closer with China. But I think overall, Havana is very interested in an American response to whatever it is they do. So they're treading pretty carefully, and no one expects this relationship to develop or continue developing very quickly.
Well, it says that Cuba hasn't changed in the last, 70 years, right? They allowed the Russians to come in and put missiles there. They allowed anyone to come in. And right now, the Cubans need money. The Russians have cut them off. It was always about economic transactions because their economy is still stuck in many ways in the 1950s. So the Chinese are just putting money up and the Cubans are saying, sure. And it's also a way for the Cubans to poke at the United States for kind of, pulling back on, putting the embargo back on. and cutting back on travel. So for the Cubans, it's a win-win. They get money and they get to annoy the United States out of it.